Welcome to my channel. Welcome to that channel.
The mist over Lochdub was of that particularly tenacious Scottish variety that suggested it had no intention of lifting before next Tuesday. It clung to the mountainsides like damp cotton wool and muffled the sounds of the village, reducing the world to shades of relentless grey. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth regarded the meteorological misery from the warmth of the Tommel Castle Hotel kitchen. He was not, strictly speaking, on duty. Well, he was on duty in the sense that he was wearing his uniform. But he was currently engaged in the vital police work of scrounging a second breakfast and avoiding the telephone in the police station, which he felt in his bones was about to ring with annoying inquiries from headquarters in Strathbane. "Another sausage, Hamish?" asked Mr. Johnson, the hotel manager, a man whose perpetually worried expression was currently focused on a sizzling frying pan. He knew Hamish's presence usually meant a minor dent in the kitchen's inventory, but having the village policeman beholden to you for bacon was a cheap insurance policy in the Highlands. Well, if you're forcing me, Mr. Johnson," Hamish said, sighing as if accepting a terrible burden. He was a tall, gangly man with flaming red hair and hazel eyes that often held a deceptive look of bovine vacancy. Currently, that vacancy was focused on the sausage. At his feet, his small, nondescript dog, Lugs, let out a sympathetic yawn, mirroring his master's talent for conserving energy. "Quiet morning?" Johnson asked, sliding a plate loaded with cholesterol across the steel counter. "Too quiet," Hamish mumbled around a mouthful of black pudding. "When it's this quiet, it means the universe is building up steam to hit me with something unpleasant, usually involving sheep or tourists. Tourists bothering sheep." Hamish's philosophy was simple. Life in Lochdub was perfect as long as nothing happened. Crime meant work. Work meant attention from his superiors. Attention from superiors meant the terrifying possibility of promotion and a transfer to the soulless concrete jungle of Glasgow. Therefore, Hamish's primary goal in life was to keep the peace by doing as little actual policing as possible, while appearing so intensely mediocre that no one in authority would ever dream of promoting him. He had just speared the second sausage when the peace was shattered, not by a sheep, but by the aggressive, throaty roar of a highly tuned engine. The noise cut through the muffled atmosphere outside, a vulgar intrusion on the village's morning stupor. Hamish and Mr. Johnson paused, forks hovering. A vehicle slewed into the hotel car park, spraying gravel with arrogant disregard. Through the rain-streaked window, they saw a Range Rover of such pristine, showroom blackness that it seemed an affront to the mud-splattered reality of Sutherland. "Oh dear," Mr. Johnson said, peering out. "That will be Mr. Cruikshank, the Londoner who bought the old boathouse." Hamish chewed slowly. He had heard the rumours on the village grapevine, which was faster than broadband and twice as vicious. A rich southerner intended to turn the derelict Lochside boathouse into something called a gastronomic destination. The driver's door opened, and Bartholomew Cruikshank emerged. It was a squeeze. He was a man of immense proportions, a vast globe of a human being, encased in a tweed suit so loud it could probably be heard in Inverness. His face was florid, the colour of underdone beef, and topped with a thinning thatch of pale hair, whipped by the wind. Even from inside the kitchen, Hamish could sense the man's suffocating aura of self-importance. Cruikshank did not just walk, he proceeded. He marched towards the hotel entrance, ignoring the stunning vista of the loch and the mountains, as if they were unsatisfactory backdrops painted solely for his arrival. A moment later, the kitchen swing doors banged open. Cruikshank stood there, filling the frame, radiating cold air and entitlement. He looked around the kitchen with an expression of profound distaste, his nose wrinkling as if he had detected a blocked drain rather than frying bacon. "You," Cruikshank boomed, pointing a sausage-like finger at Mr. Johnson. "Are you the functionary in charge of this establishment?" Mr. Johnson stiffened. "I am the manager, sir. Can I help you?" "I doubt it. I require coffee. Real coffee, not that instant sludge you Highlanders usually poison yourselves with, and a pastry. Something delicate. Pain au chocolat, perhaps, assuming you know what that is." Hamish remained still, making himself as inconspicuous as a 6'3" redhead in a police uniform could be. He adopted his best village idiot expression, letting his jaw go slack. Lugs, sensing the shift in atmosphere, retreated under a prep table. Cruikshank's piggy eyes swiveled and landed on Hamish. He took in the slightly worn uniform, the relaxed posture, the plate of fried food. He snorted, a sound like a distressed walrus. "Good God. Is this what passes for the constabulary up here? Eating on duty, officer." Just keeping my strength up, sir, Hamish said in a slow, thick Highland drawl that he liked to exaggerate for Sassenachs. It's a wild country. You never know when you might need to lift a sheep out of a bog. Cruikshank rolled his eyes toward the ceiling. Quaint. I am Bartholomew Cruikshank. You may have heard of me. I am the food critic for the Sunday Clarion. I am also the new owner of the boathouse property, which I intend to transform into the Golden Stag, the finest dining experience north of Edinburgh. I expect the local police to keep the riffraff away from my investments. Oh, aye, Hamish said, taking a sip of his lukewarm tea. The boathouse. That's where old Angus MacGregor used to keep his illicit whiskey still before he fell in the loch and drowned. Terrible draughty place. It will be renovated, Cruikshank snapped. It will be an oasis of civilization. I intend to show these barbarians what actual food tastes like. None of this deep-fried haggis nonsense. He eyed Hamish's remaining black pudding with genuine revulsion. Bringing culture to this sodden wilderness is a burden, but someone must do it. Cruikshank turned back to Mr. Johnson, who looked ready to hit the man with his spatula. Well, the coffee? I haven't got all day to watch the local constabulary gorging himself on pig fat. Hamish finished his breakfast calmly as Mr. Johnson hurried off to find something that might pass for a delicate pastry. The policeman's outward demeanour was one of placid stupidity, but his mind, sharp as a razor beneath the red hair, was already cataloguing Bartholomew Cruikshank. The man was a bully, a glutton, and profoundly arrogant. He had insulted the local food, the local police, and the general intelligence of everyone north of the border in under 3 minutes. In a tight-knit, fiercely proud community like Lockdub, Bartholomew Cruikshank wasn't just opening a restaurant, he was painting a large, vibrant target on his own enormous back. Hamish sighed internally. The quiet spell was definitely over. He just hoped that when the inevitable trouble started, it wouldn't happen before he had his lunch. Cruikshank swept out of the kitchen with his subpar pastry, leaving a vacuum of silence that was quickly filled by the rhythmic thump-thump of Lug's tail against the floorboards. Hamish watched the black Range Rover roar away, its tires spitting more gravel as it headed toward the lockside. He let out a long, theatrical sigh and reached for the last piece of toast. He had a feeling that the Golden Stag was going to be more of a lead weight around the neck of the village than a culinary oasis, and he had an even stronger feeling that his own peaceful life was about to be the first casualty of Cruikshank's ambition. The next 2 days did little to disabuse him of that notion. The village was rife with reports of the Englishman's tyranny. He had already managed to offend the postmistress, Mrs. Kennedy, by complaining about the archaic speed of the mail, and he had nearly started a riot at the local grocery by demanding organic truffles and criticizing the provenance of their tinned peas. Cruikshank was a man who didn't just burn bridges, he blew them up and then complained about the quality of the rubble. It was on the third morning, a Tuesday of such persistent, bone-chilling drizzle that even the seagulls looked depressed, that the interruption Hamish had been dreading finally arrived. He was in his small police cottage, the wood-burning stove crackling with a comforting warmth that he had every intention of staying near for the duration of the day. A pot of coffee was brewing, and he had just settled into his armchair with a book on Highland folklore when the telephone on the wall gave a shrill, demanding jangle. Hamish stared at it. He considered, briefly, pretending he was out on an emergency patrol, perhaps a particularly difficult sheep rescue, but the phone was persistent. With a groan of resignation, he heaved himself up and answered. Lockdub Police Station, Constable Macbeth speaking, he said, injecting a note of profound weariness into his voice. Hamish, it's Archie McLean. The voice on the other end was high-pitched and breathless, trembling with a mixture of shock and that peculiar Highland excitement that comes with being the first to witness a disaster. You've got to get down to the old boathouse, Hamish. Now, it's that Sassenach, the big one. Cruikshank, what's he done now, Archie? Has he tried to arrest a salmon for not being wild caught? No, Hamish. No, Archie gulped, the sound of the wind whistling through the receiver. He's dead. And it's a terrible sight, Hamish. It's not right at all. Hamish felt the familiar, cold knot of professional annoyance tighten in his stomach. A murder, or a messy accident, meant reports. It meant DC Vars Blair. It meant the end of the stove and the coffee and the quiet. Stay there, Archie. Don't touch a thing, Hamish commanded, though he knew Archie wouldn't touch a dead body for all the whiskey in Scotland. He pulled on his heavy, slightly frayed greatcoat, whistled for lugs, and stepped out into the dank misery. He took his ancient Land Rover, the engine protesting with a series of metallic coughs before rattling into life. The drive to the boathouse was short, but it gave him enough time to observe the village. People were already peering through their curtains. News in Lockdub travelled faster than a Highland gale. Chow sat on a lonely stretch of the shore, a stone structure that had once been handsome, but was now draped in scaffolding and plastic sheeting. The Range Rover was parked crookedly near the entrance. Archie McLean was standing several yards away from the door, his face a shade of pale green that matched the moss on the rocks. Inside, Archie pointed a shaking hand. I was bringing him some lobsters he had ordered, insisted they be delivered to the door. He did. The door was ajar. I called out, but there was no answer. Then I saw, Hamish nodded, his hazel eyes scanning the area. No signs of a struggle outside, no footprints other than Archie's in the mud, though the rain would have washed any others away hours ago. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, Lugs trotting cautiously at his heels, his hackles slightly raised. The interior of the boathouse was a chaotic blend of luxury and construction. Expensive Italian marble tiles lay in crates next to bags of cement, but it was the center of the room that held the eye. A large, ornate dining table had been set up amidst the dust, covered in a white linen cloth. On it was a spread that would have fed a small army: cheeses, meats, jars of preserves, and several bottles of wine. And there was Bartholomew Cruikshank. The man was slumped forward across the table in a parody of a drunken stupor. But it wasn't the position that was bizarre, it was the presentation. His head was resting in a massive silver-serving tureen of what appeared to be highly expensive, truffle-infused lobster bisque. The soup had overflowed, staining the white linen a dull, creamy orange. More oddly, a string of sausage, the very ones he had mocked in the hotel kitchen, had been draped around his neck, like a grotesque garland. Hamish walked forward, his boots clicking on the stone floor. He didn't need a doctor to tell him Cruikshank was gone. The man's skin was a mottled purple, and his eyes, visible just above the rim of the tureen, were wide and bulging with a final, desperate surprise. Well now, Hamish murmured to himself, his deceptive laziness replaced by a sharp, cold focus. He noticed a small, overturned jar of expensive honey near the victim's hand, and a single, delicate silver spoon lying on the floor, perfectly clean. He didn't touch anything. He just stood there, looking at the sausages, the soup, and the sheer excess of the scene. It was a death designed to humiliate, a theatrical execution that shouted of local resentment and petty vengeance. A glutton's end, Hamish whispered. At that moment, the distant, aggressive wail of a police siren began to echo off the mountains. It was coming from the direction of Strathbane. DC-5's Blair was on his way, and he was undoubtedly already practicing the insults he would hurl at the lazy village idiot who had let a high-profile Londoner get murdered on his watch. Hamish sighed, patting Log's head. His quiet life hadn't just been interrupted, it had been detonated. Would you like me to continue with the next section, where DCY Blair arrives and the official investigation begins? The sirens grew from a distant wail to a piercing, rhythmic scream that seemed to bounce off the stone walls of the boathouse, making Lugs whimper and retreat further behind a stack of Italian marble. 2 white and blue patrol cars from Strathbane skidded into the mud outside, followed by a black sedan that could only belong to the CID, or the engines had even died. The doors flew open, and Detective Chief Inspector Blair erupted from the vehicle like a small, angry volcano. Blair was a man of stunted height and immense temper, with a face the color of an overripe plum and a mustache that twitched with every perceived slight. He marched toward the boathouse, flanked by his 2 sycophants, Detectives Anderson and MacNab, who trailed behind him like nervous shadows. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed before he had even crossed the threshold. "If I find out you've touched so much as a breadcrumb in there, I'll have you directing traffic in a Glasgow tunnel by sunset." Hamish straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers and adopting an expression of wide-eyed, vacant helpfulness. "Good morning to you, sir." "I've touched nothing, just as the regulations say. I was just keeping poor Archie here from fainting into the loch." Blair ignored him, pushing past to survey the scene. He stopped dead when he saw the spectacle at the table. For a moment, even the DCI was silenced by the sheer absurdity of Cruikshank's demise. He stared at the soup tureen, the orange stains, and the festive garland of sausages. "God in heaven," MacNab whispered behind him. Is that a Cumberland or a Lincoln?" "Shut up, MacNab," Blair snapped, finding his voice. He turned his glare onto Hamish, his eyes narrowing. "Well, what is this, Macbeth? Some kind of sick Highland joke? A local welcome to the neighborhood?" "It's a murder, sir, I'd be thinking," Hamish said mildly, his voice thick with a deceptive lilt. "Mr. Cruikshank was found just like that by Mr. McLean. He's the local lobster fisherman, sir. A very honest man." Blair's gaze swung like a turret toward Archie, who was still shivering by the door. honest, is he? Or is he a disgruntled local who didn't like a Londoner telling him his lobsters weren't up to scratch? You! Blair lunged toward Archie, who recoiled. How long did you know the deceased? Did you have a row about the price of shellfish? Did you decide to drown him in his own soup? No, sir. I just brought the delivery, Archie stammered, his cap clutched to his chest. I liked the man well enough. He paid in cash. Cash, eh? Robbery gone wrong then, Blair declared, clapping his hands together as if the case were already closed. The killer was interrupted, panicked, and decided to make a statement. It's obvious. Anderson, get this shivering wreck to the car. I want a full statement, and don't be gentle. McNab, get the forensics team in here, and someone get those sausages off him, it's making me hungry. Hamish watched with a sinking heart as Archie was led away. He looked at the clean silver spoon on the floor, the one Blair hadn't even noticed, and the way the honey jar was positioned. If it were a robbery, why would the killer stay to arrange the sausages? Why the soup? Sir, Hamish ventured, if I might just point out you might not. Macbeth, Blair roared, his face deepening to a dangerous shade of magenta. You are a village bobby. Your job is to find lost cats and tell tourists where the toilets are. Leave the detection to the professionals. You're dismissed. Get back to your little police station and stay off the radio. I don't want your theories cluttering up my airwaves. As you wish, sir, Hamish said, bowing his head in mock submission. He whistled for lugs and began to amble toward the door, looking for all the world like a man relieved to be relieved of duty. Tras. He stepped out into the rain. His hazel eyes were far from vacant. He knew Archie McLean couldn't kill a fly, let alone orchestrate a theatrical execution like this. He also knew that the answer wasn't in the mud or the fingerprints, but in the gossip. Cruikshank had offended half the county in a week. To find the killer, Hamish would not need a forensics lab, he'd need a very large pot of tea, and someone who knew where all the village skeletons were buried. He climbed into his Land Rover, the engine groaning as he turned the key. He wasn't going back to the station to wait for orders. He was going to the village stores. Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, would have heard the sirens, and she'd be bursting with more information than a police computer could hold in a decade. The Land Rover's wipers made a rhythmic, protesting squeak as they struggled against the Highland deluge, a sound that Hamish found strangely comforting compared to the abrasive shouting of DC Thurst Blair. He steered the vehicle away from the loch, his mind already filtering through the bizarre tableau he had left behind. Sausages, a soup tureen, a food critic literally face down in his own subject matter. It was too poetic for a common thief, and far too messy for a professional. As he passed the village green, he saw the curtains of the old manse twitch. The village was watching, its collective breath held in anticipation of the scandal. He pulled up in front of the Lochdub General Stores and Post Office, the hub of all local intelligence, and stepped out into the chill. Luggs followed with a disgruntled shake of his coat, clearly hoping for a drier environment. Inside, the shop was a comforting jumble of woolen sweaters, tinned peaches, and the sharp, medicinal tang of floor wax. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Kennedy, her spectacles perched precariously on the end of her nose, and her eyes gleaming with a predatory curiosity that could have rivaled a hawk's. Well now, Hamish Macbeth, she began, her voice a sharp trill that demanded immediate satisfaction. The sirens have been going like the end of the world is upon us, and I see that man Blair has arrived with his usual circus. Is it true? Has that English fellow at the boathouse finally met his maker, or has he just choked on his own importance? Hamish sighed, leaning against the counter in a way that suggested he had all the time in the world and no particular place to be. It's a sad day for the village, Mrs. Kennedy, he lied smoothly, knowing full well she saw through it. Mr. Cruikshank is indeed no longer with us. A very messy business. I don't suppose you would have a pot of tea on the go? My bones are feeling the damp. Mrs. Kennedy didn't even hesitate. She disappeared into the back room, and the sound of a kettle being filled reached his ears. Tea and a scone, Hamish. But don't you be thinking you're getting them for free if you don't tell me what's really happened. The word is he was murdered in his bed by a gang from Glasgow. Hamish waited until the tea was poured and a generously buttered scone was placed before him before he spoke. Not a gang, and not in his bed. He was in his dining room, Mrs. Kennedy. And he wasn't alone, though I suspect his dinner guests weren't the sort to stay for coffee. He took a long, appreciative sip of the tea, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. He was found in a soup tureen, with sausages around his neck. Mrs. Kennedy froze, a jar of marmalade halfway to the shelf. Sausages? You don't mean the ones from the hotel? Or were they from Mr. Patel's? Hamish's ears pricked up. Mr. Patel's. I didn't know he sold sausages. Oh, he doesn't, she replied, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But Cruikshank was over there just yesterday, screaming blue murder about the smell of spices. Said it was ruining the olfactory purity of his new restaurant venture. He threatened to have the health inspectors shut the curry shop down. Poor Mr. Patel was in tears, and you know he's a man who prides himself on his hygiene. Hamish chewed his scone thoughtfully, the crumbs falling onto his worn uniform. So he had made an enemy of the curry shop. Who else? Mrs. Kennedy snorted, a sound of pure Highland derision. Who else? Who didn't he offend, Hamish? He told the minister that the church bells were acoustically offensive and suggested they be silenced on Sunday mornings so he could sleep in. He told Miss Hartley that her prize-winning roses were pedestrian and that he intended to replace the village floral displays with something more avant-garde. But if you want a real grudge, you should look at the woman he brought with him from London. Hamish paused, the scone halfway to his mouth. He had a secretary, didn't he? Miss Higgins, Miss Clara Higgins, Mrs. Kennedy corrected. A poor, mousy thing. He treated her like a footstool. I saw them in here on Monday. He yelled at her in front of everyone because she had forgotten to pack his specific brand of organic sea salt. The look she gave him, well, if looks could kill, you wouldn't have needed any sausages, Hamish. She looked like she wanted to put him through the bacon slicer right then and there. Hamish noted the name with a mental flourish. Clara Higgins, the invisible woman. People often forgot that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who is treated as if they are not there. And where is Miss Higgins now? He asked, finishing the scone and looking longingly at the teapot. Staying at the hotel, I would imagine. Cruikshank would not let her stay at the boathouse until the servants' quarters were finished. He was a piece of work, that one. Always talking about civilizing us, as if we were savages in loincloths. Hamish nodded, his mind drifting back to the sausages. They were a specific touch. Not just a murder, but a mockery. A glutton killed by his own greed. He thanked Mrs. Kennedy, who was already reaching for the telephone to relay the soup tureen detail to the rest of the village, and stepped back out into the rain. He needed to visit the Tommel Castle Hotel, not for another breakfast, but to see if he could find the mousy Miss Higgins. But as he walked toward the Land Rover, he was intercepted by a small, hurried figure dodging the deep puddles. It was Mr. Patel, his apron still on, looking frantic and disheveled. Constable Macbeth, thank goodness. Those men, the ones from the city, they are at my shop. They are throwing my jars. They say I am a murderer because of a row over cumin. Blair, true to form, was already bullying the most obvious target. Hamish felt a surge of protective anger. Mr. Patel was a gentle soul who wouldn't hurt a fly, regardless of how much his olfactory purity was insulted. Don't you worry, Mr. Patel, Hamish said, his voice dropping into a low, steady tone that usually calmed even the most panicked sheep. You go back and tell them nothing. I'll be along shortly. I just have to see a lady about some salt. He watched Mr. Patel scurry away and then looked up at the grey, weeping sky. Pieces were starting to move, but they weren't the pieces Blair was looking at. To the DCI, it was a simple matter of a local row. To Hamish, it felt like something much older and much more calculated a play, where everyone had a role, and the leading man had been silenced before he could finish his first course. He climbed into the car, lugs jumping into the passenger seat, and turned the key. The engine roared into life, sounding almost as angry as the Highland wind. Hamish pulled the Land Rover into the sweeping gravel driveway of the Tommel Castle Hotel, the tires crunching over stones that were far more refined than the muddy track leading to the boathouse. The hotel, a grand Victorian pile of turrets and grey stone, looked down upon the village with a regal indifference that always made Hamish feel like he should have polished his boots, or perhaps his entire personality. He adjusted his peaked cap, checked that his tie was only slightly askew, and stepped out into the biting wind that was currently whipping the mist into frenzied spirals. Lugs, ever the opportunist and a connoisseur of comfort, decided that the back seat of the Land Rover was a far better place than the plush rugs of the lobby, especially given his current state of dampness. Hamish left him to his nap, knowing the dog would only track mud onto the expensive Wilton carpets, and pushed through the heavy oak doors that served as a portal to a world of quiet wealth. The lobby smelled of high-grade beeswax, expensive wood smoke, and the faint, lingering perfume of women who never had to worry about the price of eggs. It was a world away from the gritty, soup-stained reality of the murder scene. Standing by the massive stone fireplace, looking effortlessly elegant in a cashmere sweater of soft primrose and a tweed skirt that spoke of old money and perfect tailoring, was Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She was the daughter of the colonel, the owner of the hotel, and a woman who occupied a permanent, slightly painful corner of Hamish's heart. She was currently looking at a tall crystal vase of lilies with an expression of mild concern, as if the flowers were failing to meet her high standards of floral conduct. "Hamish," she said, turning as he approached. Her voice was like fine silk, smooth and cool, with that English accent that always made Hamish feel a bit more Scottish than he actually was. "I heard the news. The village is buzzing like a disturbed hive. I suppose you're here about the unfortunate Mr. Cruikshank. It's all anyone is talking about in the dining room, though most people seem more concerned about whether the Golden Stag will still open its doors." "I, Priscilla," Hamish replied, adopting his most professional, albeit slightly weary, tone. He took off his cap and held it in both hands, looking for all the world like a humble petitioner. "It's a bad business. A man can't even have a quiet bowl of soup in Lochdub anymore without it becoming a matter for the authorities in Strathbane. I'm looking for his secretary, a Miss Clara Higgins. I believe she's staying here in the hotel while the boathouse was being finished." Priscilla sighed, a small, graceful movement of her shoulders that Hamish found distractingly pretty. "She is, poor thing. She's currently in the small parlour, quite distraught, though I suspect more from the shock of the situation than any deep-seated grief for her employer. He was, by all accounts, a monstrous man, Hamish. Even Papa, who is usually quite tolerant of the eccentricities of the wealthy newcomers, found him entirely excessive and lacking in basic decorum. Excessive is one word for it, Hamish agreed, shifting his weight, though dead is the one currently occupying my mind. What did the colonel make of him, exactly? He usually has a good nose for a wrong un. Priscilla led him toward a corner of the lobby, where two wingback chairs sat in the shadows of a large potted palm. He thought he was a fraud, Hamish. Not a financial one. Cruikshank certainly had the money to throw around, but a social one. He tried too hard. He talked incessantly about his connections in London and his influence in the culinary world, but he lacked the effortless grace of someone born to that life. He was a man who used his wealth like a blunt instrument to intimidate those he deemed inferior. And he was particularly cruel to that secretary. I saw them at dinner in our dining room last night. He made her stand while he ate, because he said her posture offended the symmetry of the table. It was quite public and utterly humiliating. Hamish felt a spark of interest. He made her stand? During the entire dinner? Yes. It was quite appalling. Everyone in the dining room was uncomfortable, but Cruikshank didn't seem to care. He relished the power play. He was eating something particularly foul-smelling truffle-laden offal, I believe, and he forced her to describe each bite to him as he ate it, as if she were a tape recorder or a performing pet. It was a performance of pure, unadulterated malice. Hamish leaned back, his mind working through the image of the boathouse, the soup, the sausages, the mockery. "Priscilla, you have a keen eye for these things. Did he have any visitors? Anyone who didn't fit the London mold or the usual tourist crowd?" She tilted her head, a lock of blonde hair falling perfectly across her forehead. "There was one man. He arrived yesterday afternoon, just as the mist was coming in. Not a guest, just a visitor. He looked out of place, rougher around the edges. He didn't come through the front door. He met Cruikshank in the garden by the old sundial. I only noticed because I was in the conservatory checking the orchids. They seemed to be arguing. The stranger handed Cruikshank an envelope, and for the first time, I saw that man look truly rattled. He wasn't the bully in that moment, he was the one being bullied. He looked quite grey under his tan. A stranger in the garden, Hamish mused, his hazel eyes sharpening. Did you get a look at him? He was medium height, wearing a waxed jacket that had seen better decades, cap pulled low. He looked like 1,000 other men in the Highlands, except for one thing. He had a limp, a very pronounced one, as if one leg were slightly shorter than the other. He walked with a hitching motion that was quite distinctive, even from a distance. Hamish felt the pieces of the puzzle shift. A man with a limp, an envelope, a bully suddenly bullied. It was a far cry from DCI, Blair's theory of a disgruntled lobster fisherman or a local shopkeeper. It suggested a past, something Cruikshank had tried to bury under layers of expensive linen and aggressive food criticism. "Thank you, Priscilla," Hamish said, rising from the chair and replacing his cap. "You've given me more to think about than a whole file of forensics. Is Miss Higgins still in the small parlour?" "She is. But be gentle, Hamish. She's like a bird that's spent too long in a very small cage. She doesn't quite know what to do with her freedom yet, and she seems terrified that the cage door might slam shut again." "I'm always gentle," Hamish said, with a ghost of a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It's the one thing the Strathbane police haven't managed to beat out of me yet. I'll go and see if she can tell me about this mysterious man with the limp. He left Priscilla by the fire and made his way toward the parlor, his mind already drifting to the next step. The romantic tension with Priscilla always left him feeling a bit unsettled, like a man walking on thin ice, but the scent of a real clue was enough to keep him focused. He reached the parlor door and paused. Through the glass, he could see Clara Higgins. She wasn't crying, she was staring at a plate of untouched sandwiches with an expression of profound bewilderment. Hamish straightened his tunic, cleared his throat, and prepared to play his favorite role, the harmless, slow-witted village constable. It was time to find out what was in that envelope. Hamish stepped into the small parlor of the Tommel Castle Hotel, moving with a deliberate, slow-footed caution, as if he were afraid the very air might shatter if he moved too quickly. The room was a sanctuary of faded Victorian splendor, filled with the scent of dried rose petals and the oppressive weight of 1,000 silent afternoons. Clara Higgins sat on the edge of a velvet settee, her figure so slight and shadowed by the heavy drapes that she appeared almost translucent. She was clutching a handkerchief with a white-knuckled intensity that suggested it was the only thing keeping her from drifting away entirely. Hamish took off his cap and stood by the door, projecting an aura of harmless, rural simplicity that usually encouraged people to speak far more than they intended. He looked like a man whose greatest concern was the price of wool, not the mechanics of a cold-blooded murder. "Miss Higgins," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a soft, melodic lilt that was as soothing as a Highland burn. "I'm sorry to be bothering you at such a time. I am Constable Macbeth, from the village. I'm just here to see if there's anything you might need, or maybe just to hear if you remembered anything small from yesterday. Sometimes it's the little things that matter most, you see." Clara looked up, her eyes wide and red-rimmed, her face a pale mask of exhaustion. She seemed relieved that he wasn't DCI Blair, whose shouting had already echoed through the hotel corridors earlier that morning. "He was so loud, Constable," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fireplace. "Mr. Cruikshank, I mean. He lived his life at a volume that most people can't imagine. And now, the silence is almost worse." Hamish nodded sympathetically, taking a seat in a nearby chair with a heavy creak of wood. "He was a man of great appetites, I hear. Priscilla tells me he had a visitor yesterday, a man with a bit of a limp. Met him in the garden." Clara flinched, her fingers knotting the handkerchief into a tight ball. "That was Mr. Miller, an old associate from London. Or a victim, more like. Bartholomew, Mr. Cruikshank, had a way of acquiring things, including people's livelihoods. Mr. Miller was a chef whose restaurant was ruined after a particularly vicious review Bartholomew wrote 5 years ago. He came here to plead for a loan, to start again. He was desperate. Why? And did he get his loan?" Hamish asked, watching the way her gaze darted toward the window. "Bartholomew laughed at him," she said, a spark of sudden, sharp resentment flickering in her eyes. "He told him that he didn't invest in failures. He gave him an envelope, but it wasn't money. It was a copy of the original review, framed in gold. He told Mr. Miller to keep it as a reminder of why he shouldn't play with the big boys." Hamish felt a cold stir of disgust. Cruikshank hadn't just been a bully, he had been a sadist. But before he could dig deeper into the mystery of the man with the limp, the parlor doors were flung open with such violence that they struck the walls. DC First, a triumphant, glowing shade of crimson that made him look like a ticking time bomb in a cheap suit. He was flanked by Anderson and MacNab, who both looked remarkably smug. "Well, Macbeth, still playing social worker to the witnesses? You can stop wasting your time and the taxpayers' money. We've got him. The case is practically wrapped up and tied with a bow." Hamish stood up slowly, his face carefully blank. "Got him, sir. You mean the man with the limp?" Blair snorted, a sound of pure derision. "The man with the what? Don't be ridiculous. We've arrested that shopkeeper, Patel. We found a witness who saw him shouting at Cruikshank yesterday afternoon, and more importantly, we found the weapon. Or at least, the source of it." "The source, sir?" Hamish inquired, his brow furrowing in a way that Blair always took for stupidity. "The sausages, man. The Garland. We checked the local suppliers. Patel's shop is the only one in 3 parishes that stocks that specific brand of spicy, garlic-heavy sausage. And we found a receipt in Cruikshank's wastebasket for a bulk order Patel delivered personally last night. He obviously went there, had another row, and used the very product he had delivered to mock the man he had just killed. It's classic Highland resentment. K-cut case of local versus outsider gone terminal." Blair puffed out his chest, already clearly imagining the commendation he would receive for such a swift and decisive resolution. Hamish looked at Blair, then at the floor, and finally at the ceiling, as if searching for inspiration. "Mr. Patel, sir, but he's a man who wouldn't step on a spider if he could help it. And besides, there's a small problem with the sausages, if I might be so bold." Blair's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "And what small problem would that be, Macbeth?" Hamish cleared his throat, leaning in as if sharing a secret. "Well, sir, you see, the sausages around Mr. Cruikshank's neck, they were pork. I saw the casing and the texture when I was looking at the scene. Now, Mr. Patel is a very devout Muslim. He doesn't stock pork in his shop, sir. Never has. He sells beef and lamb and vegetarian options, but he wouldn't touch a pork sausage with a 10-foot pole, let alone handle them to make a necklace for a corpse. If there was a receipt for sausages in the bin, they must have been the specialty veal ones he sells, not the pork ones found on the body." Blair's face went from crimson to a dark, bruised purple. The silence in the room became brittle. Anderson and MacNab looked at each other, their smugness evaporating like mist in the sun. "And another thing, sir," Hamish continued, his voice mild and relentless. "I noticed when I was at the boathouse that Mr. Cruikshank was missing his left shoe. Just the left one. Now, if Mr. Patel was in a murderous rage over a business row, why would he take one shoe? It doesn't fit the pattern of a man like Patel. It's a bit too calculated, a bit too much like a distraction." Claire let out a roar of frustration that made Clara Higgins jump nearly 6 inches off the settee. "I don't care about his shoes, Macbeth, and I don't care about your theological debates over meat products. We have a witness. We have a motive. Patel is in the cells, and that's where he's staying." Blair turned on his heel and stormed out, his subordinates trailing behind like scolded curs. Hamish watched them go, his expression one of gentle pity. He knew Blair would ignore the truth until it hit him over the head, but Hamish couldn't afford that luxury. He turned back to Clara, who was watching him with a new kind of intensity. "Miss Higgins," he said softly, "about that shoe. Did Mr. Cruikshank have any particular habits, anything he kept hidden, perhaps in his footwear?" Clara hesitated, then slowly nodded. "He was terrified of being robbed. He had a secret compartment in the heel of his left brogue. He kept a key there, a key to a safe deposit box in London." Hamish felt the thrill of the hunt settle into his bones. The sausages were a red herring, a crude attempt to frame a local, but the missing shoe was the real trail. The killer hadn't just wanted to humiliate Cruikshank, they wanted what he was hiding. He tipped his cap to Clara and walked out into the lobby, his mind already racing toward the next move in this deadly game of Highland chess. Hamish stepped out of the warm, beeswax-scented lobby of the Tommel Castle Hotel and back into the relentless grey weeping of the Sutherland sky. The wind had picked up, a sharp, biting thing that seemed to have come straight from the Arctic to remind the inhabitants of Lockdub of their own insignificance. She pulled the collar of his greatcoat up around his ears, feeling the dankness begin to seep into the wool, and stood for a moment by the Land Rover. Lugs was a small, warm heap on the passenger seat, his eyes following his master with a look of mild reproach for having been left in the cold. Hamish didn't climb immediately. Instead, he stared at the hotel's kitchen entrance, the very place where his day had begun with a stolen sausage and a sense of impending doom. He thought about Blair, currently puffed up with the pride of a man who had successfully arrested a peaceful shopkeeper for the crime of being an easy target. He thought about the pork sausages, those distinct, fatty links that Mr. Patel would never touch, and he thought about the missing shoe. A crime of passion is usually a mess of fingerprints and loud noises, but a crime of mockery, one involving soup and sausages and hidden keys, required a certain level of intimate, local knowledge. It required someone who knew that the village would blame the outsider, the newcomer, or the minority, while the real hunter blended into the background like a deer in the bracken. He turned away from the driver's door and began to walk toward the back of the hotel, his boots crunching on the wet gravel. He wasn't heading for the front door this time, he was heading for the service entrance. Hamish had a particular talent for being where he wasn't expected, a skill he had honed while dodging the more energetic demands of his superiors. He slipped into the kitchen, which was now a hive of afternoon activity, as the staff prepared for the evening's dinner service. The smell of roasting meat and simmering stocks was heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the cold, orange-stained silence of the boathouse. Mr. Johnson, the manager, was standing by a large preparation table, his brow furrowed as he checked a delivery invoice. He looked up as Hamish approached, his face flickering with a momentary tension before settling back into his usual mask of harried helpfulness. Back again, Hamish. I would have thought DCI Blair would have you running errands all over the county, Johnson said, sliding a tray of glasses out of the way. He moved with a slight, almost imperceptible hitch in his stepper limp that he clearly tried to mask by leaning on the tables as he passed. Hamish watched the movement with the predatory stillness of an owl. Well, you know how it is, Mr. Johnson, Hamish said, leaning against a stack of clean towels. The DCI is a very busy man. He's convinced he's found his killer, so he's left me to wander about and stay out of his light. I was just thinking about those sausages you gave me this morning. Right tasty they were. I don't suppose you have any more of that specific brand. I have a hunger that a manse full of scones wouldn't touch. Johnson's eyes darted toward the large walk-in larder at the far end of the kitchen. The sausages? They were just a local batch, Hamish. Nothing special. I'm afraid we're all out. Why the sudden interest in breakfast meats? Hamish let a slow, vacant smile spread across his face, the one that usually convinced people he was thinking about nothing more complex than his next nap. Oh, no reason. It's just that the killer at the boathouse seems to have had a similar taste. Left a whole string of pork sausages around Mr. Cruikshank's neck. Strange thing, though they were the exact same type as the one I had here this morning. Same casing, same flecks of sage. And since Mr. Tell doesn't sell pork, I wondered where a man might find such a specific delicacy in a hurry. The silence in the kitchen seemed to sharpen, the clatter of pans and the hiss of steam suddenly feeling very far away. Johnson didn't move. He stood with the invoice in his hand, his knuckles turning a pale, bloodless white. Lochdub is a small place, Hamish. People share things, ideas, recipes, even suppliers. Hamish nodded, his hazel eyes never leaving the manager's face. Aye, they do, and they share secrets too. Like the secret of why a man who was once the head chef of a Michelin-starred restaurant was once the head chef of a Michelin-starred restaurant in London would suddenly decide to move to the middle of nowhere to manage a hotel. I was talking to Miss Higgins, you see. She mentioned a man named Milara Chef, whose life was ruined by one of Cruikshank's reviews. A man with a very distinctive limp. Johnson let out a long, shuddering breath, the mask finally slipping. He didn't look like a harried manager anymore. He looked like a man who had been carrying a crushing weight for a very long time. He reached out and pulled a chair from under the table, sinking into it with a groan. It wasn't just the review, Hamish. He didn't just ruin my restaurant. He stole my wife. He lured her away with promises of a glamorous life in London, and then he discarded her like a piece of spoiled meat when he got bored. She died of a broken heart and a bottle of gin 3 years ago. I came up here to disappear, to find some peace in the mountains, where I thought no one would ever recognize me. And then he arrived. That gluttonous, arrogant pig. He bought the boathouse and came into my kitchen and laughed in my face. He told me he'd have me fired from here too, just for the sport of it. He had a key, Hamish. Key to a safe deposit box that held the letters my wife wrote to him, letters that proved he was blackmailed her into leaving me. I couldn't let him keep them. I couldn't let him mock her memory any longer. Hamish felt a pang of genuine sympathy, but his duty, however much he disliked it, remained. The motive wasn't the golden stag or local business. It was a deep, festering wound of personal humiliation and loss. Johnson had seen an opportunity to rid himself of his tormentor and frame it in a way that would play on the village's natural tensions. He had used the very soup recipe Cruikshank had once praised to drown him, and the sausages that had been the hallmark of Johnson's old restaurant to mock his gluttony. And the shoe, Mr. Johnson? Hamish asked softly. Johnson reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver key, laying it on the table between them. I took the shoe because I couldn't get it off his foot in time. I had to get the key. I was going to burn those letters tonight. Hamish looked at the key, then at the man who had been a quiet, helpful part of the village for years. Outside, the rain continued to lash against the stones, a cold and indifferent witness to the tragedies of men. Hamish knew that if he handed this over to Blair, the DC Vars, take all the credit and Johnson would be hauled off in chains to a cell in Strathbane. But he also knew that the truth was never as simple as Blair wanted it to be. Mr. Johnson, Hamish said, his voice barely a whisper over the sound of the kitchen. I'm going to have to take that key, and I'm going to have to take you to the station. But I think there's a way we can do this that doesn't involve DCI. Blair's shouting. Not just yet. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the table. Trap was set. But it wasn't the kind of trap that involved handcuffs and sirens. It was a trap for the man who thought he had already won. Hamish left Mr. Johnson sitting amidst the gleaming copper pans of the hotel. Kitchen. The manager's head bowed, as if the very air had become too heavy to support. The silver key lay on the preparation table, a small, cold testament to a life ruined by a critic's pen. Hamish didn't pick it up yet. Instead, he watched Johnson for a long, silent moment. "I'll be taking a turn down to the station, Mr. Johnson," Hamish said, his voice as soft as the mist outside. "DCY Blair is in a fair old state about Mr. Patel, and I'd like to see if I can stop him from making a bigger fool of himself than nature intended. You stay here. Don't go wandering off into the rain. I'll be back when the shadows are a bit longer." He stepped out into the biting Highland wind, leaving the manager alone with his ghosts. The Land Rover's engine groaned as it turned over, the sound echoing off the stone walls of the hotel like a tired sigh. Hamish drove slowly toward the village, his mind clicking through the gears of a plan that required more than just the truth. He needed a performance. To satisfy the law in the person of DCY Blair, he needed a scene so obvious even a man with a plum-coloured face couldn't ignore it. He found the Lochdub police station, his home and office, transformed into a chaotic command centre. DC Fars, pacing the small room, his footsteps heavy on the floorboards, while Anderson and McNabb were busy typing reports. Mr. Patel sat in the corner, his face a picture of dignified misery. "Macbeth!" Blair barked, not even looking up. "I told you to stay out of my way. We're processing the prisoner. The case is shut. Sausages don't lie, even if the locals do." Hamish adopted his most baffled expression, scratching his red hair with a slow, clumsy finger. "Aye, sir. I'm sure you're right. It's just, well, there's the matter of the RSPB, sir." Blair stopped pacing, his mustache twitching with irritation. "The what? What have birdwatchers got to do with a murdered food critic?" Hamish leaned against the doorframe, looking perfectly gormless. "Well, you see, sir, they've had a motion sensor camera hidden in the reeds near the boathouse for months. To catch the egg stealers, they say. I just had a word with the warden. He says the camera triggered 3 times last night. He hasn't looked at the footage yet, says he needs a special cable from Inverness, but he's bringing it to the boathouse tonight at midnight to meet the proper police." Blair's eyes bulged. "A camera? At the boathouse? Why wasn't I told about this?" Hamish shrugged helplessly. "I only just remembered it myself, sir. My head likes a sieve sometimes. The warden says the footage is clear as a mountain stream. It will show the killer's face, plain as day, coming and going from the scene. He's a very particular man, the warden. Won't hand it over to anyone but a senior officer. Hell be there at the stroke of 12. Blair let out a triumphant roar, his anger instantly replaced by the greedy scent of a career-making discovery. "Midnight!" Anderson, McNabb were going to the boathouse. "Well, catch the killer, and the evidence in one go. And you, Macbeth, stay here and watch the shop. I don't want you cluttering up the crime scene with your clumsy boots." Hamish nodded obediently. "As you wish, sir. I'll just stay here and make sure Mr. Patel doesn't go anywhere." As soon as Blair and his cohorts had stormed out to fuel their car, Hamish turned to Mr. Patel. "Don't you worry, Jimmy. You'll be home for your tea soon enough. I just have to go and see a man about a bird." He didn't stay at the station. Instead, he made a quick stop at the hotel, ostensibly to check on the witnesses. He found the receptionist, a young woman named Mary, who loved a bit of gossip more than her lunch, and let the news slip. "Big night tonight, Mary," Hamish whispered, leaning over the desk. "The DCI is heading to the boathouse at midnight. They've found a hidden camera that saw everything. The killer's face, the weapon, the lot. It's all on a little silver disc. The police will be waiting there to collect it. It's a grand day for justice, isn't it?" He knew the news would reach the kitchen within minutes. He knew that a man with a silver key and a heavy conscience wouldn't be able to resist. A man who had killed to protect a secret wouldn't let that secret be broadcast on a disc. Hamish drove the Land Rover back toward the loch, but he didn't go to the boathouse entrance. He parked half a mile away, hidden by a stand of dark pines, and began the long, damp trek through the heather. The Highland night had settled in, a thick blanket of blackness and rain. Hamish moved with a surprising grace for a man of his size, his footsteps silent on the sodden earth. He reached the boathouse from the rear, slipping through the plastic sheeting that still flapped in the wind like the wings of a giant, wounded bird. The interior was cold and smelled of stale soup and expensive cheese. He found a spot behind a stack of marble crates, where the shadows were deepest, and settled in to wait. Taugs was tucked into his greatcoat, the dog's warmth a small comfort against the chill. He didn't have to wait long. Shortly before midnight, the sound of a vehicle approached, not the aggressive roar of Blair's sedan, but the quiet, rhythmic chug of a hotel utility van. The door of the boathouse creaked open, admitting a sliver of grey moonlight and the silhouette of a man who moved with a distinctive, hitching limp. The figure didn't head for the table, he headed for the corner where Hamish had mentioned the camera would be. The man began to forage frantically through the construction debris, his breathing heavy and ragged in the silence. "It's not there, Mr. Johnson," Hamish said, his voice echoing softly through the stone chamber. The figure froze, spinning around to see Hamish stepping out of the shadows, a heavy flashlight in his hand but not yet lit. "There is no camera. There is no RSPB warden. There is only a man who is tired of running and a policeman who is tired of seeing good people do bad things." Johnson slumped against a marble crate, the fight draining out of him as quickly as the rain ran off the roof. "You tricked me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I couldn't let them see. I couldn't let the world know what he did to her." Hamish walked forward, the flashlight finally clicking on, illuminating the manager's broken expression. "I know, but now we have to finish this. The DCI is on his way, and he'll be looking for a villain. I suggest we give him exactly what he expects, but on our own terms." The rain hammered a relentless, hollow drumbeat on the corrugated roof of the boathouse, underscoring the shivering silence between Hamish and Mr. Johnson. The manager stood frozen, his face illuminated by the harsh beam of the flashlight, looking like a man who had already stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the ground. "I only wanted the letters, Hamish," he whispered, his hands trembling as they clutched at the air, where he had expected to find a camera. "I couldn't let his filth be the final word on her life." Hamish looked at the man, feeling a weight of pity that he knew DC Thars, Blair would never share. To the DC Thigh, a crime of the heart was just an inefficient way to break the law. "I know, Mr. Johnson," Hamish said, "but the law is a blunt instrument, and it's about to come swinging through that door with all the grace of a runaway peat cart." The distant, high-pitched wail of sirens cut through the roar of the wind. Blair was ahead of schedule, driven by the prospect of a career-saving silver disc. Johnson's eyes went wide, the pupils dilating into black pits. The panic, sharp and jagged, finally broke through his exhaustion. He didn't look like a manager anymore, he looked like a cornered animal. "I can't go to jail, Hamish. Not for him. I won't let him win." Before Hamish moved, Johnson lunged toward the jetty door. He stumbled over a crate of marble tiles, his hitching gait causing him to sprawl across the dusty floor, but he scrambled up with a desperate, frantic energy. He was heading for the dark, churning waters of the loch, perhaps thinking that the mist and the deep would offer a kinder judgment than a Strathbane jury. "Stop now, Mr. Johnson," Hamish shouted, his deceptive laziness vanishing in a flash of athletic motion. He crossed the room in 3 strides. Lugs let out a sharp bark as police cars swerved into the mud outside. Headlights swept across the boathouse windows, casting long, frantic shadows. Johnson reached the door and flung it open, the freezing Highland gale screaming into the building, bringing a spray of stinging rain. He was on the jetty now, the old wood slick and treacherous. He looked back once, his expression a mask of pure terror, and then he slipped. It wasn't a graceful dive, it was a clumsy, violent fall. He struck the side of a moored rowboat with a sickening thud before tumbling into the black, icy water. Hamish didn't hesitate. He stripped off his heavy coat and boots and dived into the loch. The cold was a physical blow, a sudden crushing weight that threatened to squeeze the air from his lungs. He surfaced, his red hair plastered to his forehead. The water was a swirling mess of foam and weed, but he saw a dark shape bobbing near the pilings. He swam toward it, his muscles burning. He grabbed Johnson by the collar of his jacket, just as the man was slipping beneath the surface for the second time. The manager was a heavy, sodden weight, and he fought Hamish with the mindless, thrashing strength of the drowning. "Easy now," Hamish grunted, taking a mouthful of water. He managed to get a firm grip and began the slow, grueling paddle back toward the slippery ladder of the jetty. The boathouse was now a theatre of police light. DCY Blair stood at the edge of the jetty, his face a brilliant purple, screaming orders at Anderson and MacNab. "Where's the warden? Where's the disc? Macbeth, what in the name of all that's holy are you doing in the water?" Hamish hauled the gasping, shivering Johnson onto the boards, collapsing beside him as his breath came in ragged plumes. He looked up at Blair, his eyes blinking away the silt. "Now, warden, sir," Hamish panted, his voice trembling with the cold. And no camera, just a man who couldn't live with what he had done. He was trying to dispose of the evidence, the key to the truth, you might say. Blair stomped forward, his polished shoes splashing in the puddles. He looked down at the pathetic figure of Mr. Johnson and then at the silver key that had fallen onto the jetty. Johnson, the hotel manager. Blair's voice was high and incredulous. You mean to tell me this peasant killed a man of Cruikshank's standing? Over what? A bad review? Hamish sat up, his teeth chattering. A bit more than that, sir, but he's the one. He's just confessed it all to me. He came here to find the camera he thought I had found. It was a bit of a gamble, sir, but it seems to have paid off. Blair's expression shifted with remarkable speed. Confusion melted into a calculating gleam. He looked at the shivering suspect and the dramatic scene. I see, Blair said, puffing out his chest. A brilliant bit of tactical misdirection on my part, letting the suspect believe he was unobserved. Excellent work, Anderson, McNabb. Get this man into the car. Wrap him in a blanket. I want him alive for the interrogation. And Macbeth. Blair looked down at the dripping policeman with a sneer of contempt. Try not to catch pneumonia. Well, take it from here. The professionals have the situation well in hand. Hamish watched them haul Johnson away, the manager's limp more pronounced in his exhaustion. He felt the cold reaching deep into his bones, but beneath it, there was a flickering spark of satisfaction. The truth was out, the innocent were safe, and Blair was too busy feeling important to notice how much of the heavy lifting had been done by a useless peasant in a wet shirt. Hamish stood up, his joints popping as he began to wring out his sodden socks. She watched the last of the blue lights disappear into the mist, a tall, bedraggled figure alone with his dog. Home, lugs, he whispered. Before we freeze. The interior of the Lochdub police station was currently a damp, steaming laundry of a room, filled with the pungent aroma of wet wool, wood smoke, and the sharp, medicinal tang of the antiseptic Hamish had applied to a scrape on his arm. The small peat fire in the grate was working overtime, its orange glow flickering against the whitewashed walls as it struggled to dry the various items of clothing draped over every available chair. Hamish sat by the stove, wrapped in a thick moth-eaten blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and old age, cradling a mug of tea so strong it could have served as industrial solvent. Lugs was curled up at his feet, his fur occasionally let out a little puff of steam as he dreamed of chasing rabbits across a much drier landscape. Across the room, the atmosphere was far less tranquil. DC Vise Blair was pacing the narrow floorboards, his boots squeaking with every turn, while he barked into the telephone with the intensity of a man who believed that volume was a substitute for authority. Yes, Superintendent Daventry. Of course, sir. It was a delicate operation, high stakes and fraught with environmental hazards, but I maintained a firm grip on the tactical situation throughout. I realized early on that the local suspects were merely a smokescreen. I decided to use Constable Macbeth here as a sort of unconventional decoy. I knew the real killer would be lulled into a false sense of security by Macbeth's particular brand of rural incompetence. I had the boathouse under surveillance, and the moment the suspect, Johnson, attempted to destroy the evidence and flee into the loch, I initiated the intercept. I directed the water recovery myself, ensuring the suspect was secured without further loss of life. Yes, sir. A textbook resolution. I'll be submitting the full report by morning. I expect the press will want a statement regarding the boathouse butcher by the noon edition. Hamish watched Blair over the rim of his mug, his hazel eyes wide and carefully devoid of any spark of intelligence. He looked for all the world like a man who was just grateful to be indoors and out of the rain, rather than the man who had actually deciphered the motive, set the trap, and dived into freezing water to prevent a suicide. Inside, however, Hamish was calculating. Every boast Blair made was a brick in a wall that would keep Hamish safe in Lochdub. If Blair took the credit, the brass in Strathbane would see it as a triumph of city-bred was the first. Was the first. They would see Hamish as a bumbling assistant who had nearly drowned himself through sheer clumsiness. And that was exactly what Hamish needed. A hero gets promoted to Glasgow. A fool gets to stay where the air is clean and the trout are plentiful. The door to the holding cell opened, and Anderson emerged, looking bored. Behind him followed Mr. Patel, who looked weary but immensely relieved. Blair hung up the phone and turned his glare on the shopkeeper. You're lucky, Patel. If I hadn't been so sharp-eyed in noticing the discrepancies in the sausage delivery, you'd be halfway to a prison cell by now. Consider this a warning. Next time a Londoner insults your spices, call us before you start shouting threats. I'll get out of my sight before I change my mind. Mr. Patel didn't need to be told twice. He gave Hamish a quick, knowing look of gratitude. A silent acknowledgement that Hamish caught and buried instantly, and hurried out into the night. Well now, sir, Hamish said, his voice a soft, apologetic drawl. That was a fine speech you gave to the superintendent. It's a marvel how you keep all those details in your head. I was that confused in the water. I thought I was the one who grabbed him. But I suppose I must have just been bobbing about while you were shouting the orders. My memories are a bit foggy from the cold, you see. Blair stopped his pacing and looked down at Hamish with a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction. It's the shock, Macbeth. Typical of a man of your limited conditioning. You were thrashing around like a beached whale. If I hadn't been there to point out where Johnson had gone under, you'd have been hauling up nothing but seaweed. It's a good thing for this village that I don't mind getting my hands dirty with the actual police work. Aye, sir, you're right there, Hamish sighed, leaning back and letting the blanket slip a little. I'm just not cut out for the fast-paced world of the CID. I don't know how you stand the pressure. If I had to write a report like the one you're planning, I would be in a state of nervous collapse within the hour. All that talk of tactical intercepts and psychological warfare. It's like another language to me. I'd probably just write that a man got sad and jumped in the water because of some old letters, and the superintendent would have my badge for being so simple. Blair's mustache twitched. The idea that Hamish might even attempt to write a report filled him with professional horror. Exactly. You'll stay right here in this backwater, Macbeth. You don't have the vision for the big picture. You focus on petty things like shoes and sausages, while I look at the architecture of the crime. I'll handle the paperwork. You just focus on drying your trousers and try not to lose any more equipment in the loch. I'm taking MacNab and Anderson back to Strathbane tonight. We have a high-profile prisoner to process and a press conference to prepare for. I don't want you breathe a word of this to the papers. Do you hear? This is a CID matter now. Not a word, sir, Hamish promised, his face a picture of solemn obedience. I'll be as quiet as a grave. I would not want to accidentally take away from the fine work you've done. It wouldn't be right. He watched as Blair gathered his coat, signaling to his subordinates to move out. The DCI paused at the door, looking back at the small, steaming station with a look of supreme triumph. He felt like a conqueror leaving a conquered province, unaware that the province was currently laughing at him behind a mug of tea. As the police sedan roared away into the darkness, its sirens silent, but its presence still felt, the station returned to its natural state of quietude. Hamish stood up, the blanket falling away as he stretched his long, lean frame. He walked to the window and watched the red taillights vanish around the bend in the road. He was cold, he was tired, and his uniform was likely ruined, but the threat of Glasgow had been averted once again. He reached into his pocket and felt the small silver key that Blair had forgotten in his haste to be important. He would keep it safe, a quiet reminder of the tragedy of Mr. Johnson and the letters that would now never be used to hurt anyone ever again. He would return it to the proper authorities in his own time, once the circus had left town. For now, there was the fire, the dog, and the blessed, lonely piece of lockdub. He walked back to the stove, poured the last of the tea, and smiled. The village idiot had won another round, and the only price was a bit of damp wool and a DCI's ego. The silence that followed the departure of the Strathbane police was a physical presence, a thick, comforting blanket that settled over the lotched-up station like a long overdue sleep. Hamish Macbeth stood by the window for a long time, watching the twin red stars of the DCI's taillights vanish into the darkness of the glen. The rain had slowed to a gentle, persistent drizzle, the kind that whispered secrets to the heather rather than shouting at the stones. He turned back to the room, which felt cavernous and empty, now that the abrasive energy of DC Vaswaswai Blair had been withdrawn. The station was his own again. He began the slow, methodical process of tidying up not because he was particularly neat, but because the order helped him settle the restless thoughts in his mind. He folded the damp blankets, moved the chairs back to their accustomed places, and carefully banked the fire so it would last until morning. Lugs watched him with one eye open, a silent partner in the restoration of their sanctuary. The smell of Blair's cheap cigars and professional arrogance was slowly being replaced by the honest, earthy scent of peat and damp wool. Hamish felt the tension draining from his shoulders, replaced by the familiar, comfortable weight of his own uncomplicated life. He was a man who appreciated the margins of existence, the quiet spaces where nothing much happened, and everyone was the better for it. The following morning arrived with a clarity that felt like a gift from the heavens. The sky was a pale, translucent blue, and the air held the sharp, clean scent of wet pine and distant snow. Hamish dressed in a fresh uniform, though he purposely chose the tunic with the slightly frayed collar. It was a small defense against any lingering aura of competence that might have clung to him after the previous night's heroics. He walked down into the village, his long legs moving with an easy, deceptive stride that suggested he was going nowhere in particular and had all day to get there. At the general stores, the air was thick with the smell of news and fresh bread. Mrs. Kennedy was already behind the counter, her spectacles perched on the very tip of her nose as she pored over the morning edition of the Strathbane Gazette. The headline was bold and sensational. City detective cracks Highland mystery. The boathouse butcher captured. Below it was a grainy photograph of Blair looking remarkably like a pouting pigeon, though the caption described him as a master tactician who had braved the elements to secure justice. "Well, Hamish," Mrs. Kennedy said, her voice a sharp trill of amusement that cut through the morning quiet. "I see the great man has saved us all from ourselves again." According to this, he practically swam the loch with the suspect between his teeth. No mention of a local constable getting a chill, of course. Hamish leaned against the counter, adopting his most vacant and admiring expression, the one he saved for tourists and tax inspectors. "Aye, Mrs. Kennedy. It's a wonder to behold. The DCI is a man of remarkable energy. I was just happy to be there to hold his coat, so to speak. It's a fine thing for the village to have such protection from the city." She bought a tin of tobacco and a small packet of biscuits for lugs, listening as she recounted the latest version of the gossip show The Golden Stag was to be sold to a Colden Stag was to be sold to a car. Hotel chain and how Miss Higgins was planning to return to London with a generous severance package. The village was already healing, the abrasive presence of Bartholomew Cruikshank being scrubbed away by the natural, relentless rhythm of Highland life. He encountered Archie McLean near the harbour, the fisherman looking 10 years younger, now that the shadow of suspicion had been lifted. Archie pressed a brown paper bag into Hamish's hands, the contents still scuttling slightly. "For the pot, Hamish. A thank you. Not that you did much, of course, what with the DCY being the one to solve it all." His wink was slow and deliberate, a shared secret between two men who knew exactly how the world worked. Hamish thanked him and continued his walk, eventually finding himself near the gates of Tommel Castle. Priscilla was there, dressed in a riding habit that made her look like something out of a glossy magazine. She reined in her horse as he approached, her eyes holding a warmth that always made Hamish feel a sudden, painful tug of what if in the corner of his heart. "The hero returns," she said softly, the wind catching her blonde hair. "I spoke to the colonel this morning. He knows the truth, Hamish. We both do." Hamish looked at the ground, scuffing his boot in the dirt like a bashful schoolboy. "The truth is a slippery thing, Priscilla. The truth is that a man is in custody, the village is at peace, and I have a lobster waiting for my lunch. Anything else is just talk for the tourists." She laughed, a sound like clear water over stones, and reached down to pat his shoulder. "You're a stubborn man, Hamish Macbeth, but I suppose that's why you're still here." She rode away toward the hills, and Hamish watched her until she was just a speck against the green, feeling the familiar, bittersweet ache of his bachelorhood. By the time he returned to the police station, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long purple shadows across the loch. He set to work on his meal, the simple rhythmic movements of chopping carrots and peeling potatoes providing a final meditative closure to the case. He put the lobster in the pot, the steam rising to join the lingering scent of peat smoke. He sat at the small wooden table, Lugs sitting expectantly beside him, and savoured the first bite. It was quiet, it was peaceful. It was exactly as it should be. The telephone on the wall gave a sudden, sharp ring, shattering the silence. Hamish stared at it for a moment, wondering if it was Blair calling to boast or the superintendent calling to question. He picked it up with a resigned sigh. "Lochdub Police Station, Constable Macbeth speaking," he said. There was a pause, and then the frantic, high-pitched voice of Mrs. Gillespie from the upper glen filled his ear. "Hamish, you've got to come quick. My prize ewe has her head stuck in the fence again, and the ram is looking very moody." Hamish felt a slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. Now, Mrs. Gillespie. Don't you be worrying. I'll be right there, just as soon as I've finished my tea." He hung up the phone and looked at Lugs. A moody ram. Lugs. Now that's a real Highland emergency. He finished his meal, put on his cap, and stepped out into the twilight, happy to be exactly where he was. A simple village policeman in a world that, for the moment, made perfect sense. He walked into the cool evening air, the mountains standing watch over the village, and felt the immense, silent gratitude of a man who had successfully remained exactly where he wanted to be. Section number 12. The moon had barely begun to retreat behind the jagged peaks of the Quillins when Hamish Macbeth returned from Mrs. Gillespie's croft, his boots caked in a fresh layer of Highland muck and his spirit strangely buoyed by the simple, mindless violence of a disgruntled ram. There was something honest about a beast that tried to headbutt you because it was annoyed. It was a far cry from the calculated cruelty of Bartholomew Cruikshank, or the suffocating vanity of D.C. Vice Blair. He parked the Land Rover outside the police station, the engine giving one final metallic wheeze of exhaustion. The village of Lochdub lay in a state of silver-grey stillness, the only sound being the rhythmic lap of the loch against the pier. To anyone else, it was a picture of stagnant boredom, but to Hamish, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. He climbed out, lugs trotting at his heels with a renewed sense of purpose now that the rescue mission was over, and stepped into the small station that served as both his fortress and his sanctuary. He didn't go to bed immediately. The events of the past few days were still swirling in his mind, like the dregs of a particularly muddy coffee. He lit the small paraffin lamp on his desk, the yellow glow chasing the shadows back into the corners. From his pocket, he pulled out the silver key and the small bundle of letters he had retrieved from the hidden compartment of Cruikshank's shoe items he had forgotten to mention to Blair during the chaotic arrest. He sat in his creaky wooden chair and began to read. The letters were exactly what Mr. Johnson, or Miller, as he had once been, had described. They were desperate, heartbreaking pleas from a woman who had been trapped in a web of Cruikshank's making. They detailed a history of psychological torment and professional sabotage that made the murder in the boathouse seem less like a crime and more like a late, inevitable act of cleaning. Cruikshank hadn't just been a critic, he had been a collector of human misery, using his influence to destroy anyone who dared to be happy without his permission. Hamish sighed, the sound heavy in the quiet room. He looked at the flickering flame of the stove. If he handed these over to the authorities, they would become part of a public record, a final indignity for a woman who had already suffered enough. They would be dissected by lawyers and splashed across the tabloids that Blair so dearly loved. And for what? To provide a slightly clearer motive for a man who had already confessed. Hamish knew that justice and the law were often two different animals that rarely grazed in the same field. He leaned forward and opened the door of the peat stove. One by one, he fed the letters into the embers. He watched the paper curl and blacken, the words of a dead woman turning into sparks that danced up the chimney and out into the Highland night. The silver key followed, dropped deep into the ash where it would remain until the stove was cleaned, months from now. By then, it would be just another piece of nameless scrap metal. Cal, the following weeks, saw the boathouse butcher story slowly slide off the front pages, replaced by a scandal involving a minor royal and a jet ski. Mr. Johnson was formally charged and moved to a prison in Edinburgh to await trial. The village, with the pragmatic resilience of the North, had already begun to move on. The Golden Stag remained a boarded-up shell, the scaffolding eventually being taken down by a local contractor who had not been paid and decided to repossess the wood. The Italian marble was sold off to a hotel in Inverness, and the loch side returned to its natural state of overgrown weeds and wheeling gulls. Peace, of the thick and drowsy variety, had returned to Lochdub. One afternoon, a particularly bright Tuesday that felt more like spring than winter, Hamish was sitting on the bench outside the station, polishing a button on his tunic with a lack of enthusiasm that was almost impressive. He saw the mail van pull up, and Mrs. Kennedy emerged, clutching a small, official-looking envelope. She marched toward him, her face a mask of intense, concentrated curiosity. Another one from Strathbane. Hamish, they're certainly keeping the postman busy these days. I don't suppose it's another commendation for your heroic assistance to DCY Blair. Hamish took the envelope with a faint grimace. I doubt it, Mrs. Kennedy. More like a reprimand for the state of my paperwork. Blair's still complaining that I haven't accounted for the missing shoe. He opened the letter, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the departmental letterhead. It was a formal notification from the chief constable. He read it twice, his eyes widening, and then a slow, blissful smile spread across his face.
Well?
Mrs. Kennedy prompted, leaning in so close she was practically in his lap. Is it the promotion? Are they finally sending you to Glasgow to show them how it's done? Hamish shook his head, looking up at the mountains with a look of profound relief. Quite the opposite, Mrs. Kennedy. It's a formal letter of concern. It seems DC5 Blair's report was so full of my clumsiness, lack of initiative, and general inability to follow basic forensic procedures that the board has decided I am entirely unsuitable for advancement at this time. I am to remain in Lochdub indefinitely, pending a further review of my professional development in, 5 or 6 years. Mrs. Kennedy huffed, adjusting her spectacles. Well, that's a disgrace, after all you did. Those men in the city wouldn't know a good policeman if he sat on them. Hamish laughed, a deep, genuine sound that made Lugs thump his tail against the gravel. Oh, I don't know, Mrs. Kennedy. I think they've got the measure of me exactly right. A man needs to know his limitations, after all. He watched her march back to the shop, her outrage providing her with enough energy to power the village for a week. He stood up, stretching his long arms toward the sky, feeling the sun's warmth on his face. He was safe. The useless peasant of Lochdub was exactly where he belonged. He walked back inside and set the kettle on the stove. The station was quiet, the only sound being the ticking of the clock and the gentle snore of the dog. He thought of Mr. Johnson, who would spend a long time in a cell, but who had finally found the closure he sought. He thought of Priscilla, who was likely at this moment entertaining a boring baronet in the hotel lounge. And he thought of Bartholomew Cruikshank, whose grand gastronomic destination was now just a place where the local teenagers went to drink cider and watch the stars. Hamish poured the tea into his favourite chipped mug and sat by the window. The mist was beginning to roll in from the sea, a soft white curtain that would soon hide the world from view. It was a perfect afternoon for doing absolutely nothing, and Hamish Macbeth intended to do it with all the skill and dedication at his command. The Highland peace was restored, and for once, the law had nothing left to say.